This is Saturday Agenda.
Hello, welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm Chris Kenny. The first week back in Parliament this week, and you guessed it, predictably, the Canberra Press Gallery and many commentators are talking about the Gillard comeback, another comeback from Prime Minister Julia Gillard. We keep hearing that she's coming back, and I think none of those comebacks have stuck yet, and my view of the week was slightly different to that. I think while the government did highlight some sloppiness on the opposition side, that's not really the main game at the moment. It's about how the government's performing, and I think the government had another bad week under pressure on all sorts of fronts, including job losses and the economy, with interest rates going up yesterday despite the Reserve Bank not moving. And of course the Prime Minister herself under pressure over the Craig Thompson affair and the Australia Day protest fiasco. So I think another difficult week for the government, but we'll talk about that and perhaps some different perspectives later in the program when we have our political panel join us. But first up today, I'm very pleased to welcome to the program the former ALP President and significant Indigenous leader, Warren Mundine. Thanks for joining us, Warren.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
Warren, firstly to the economy this week. Julia Gillard has very deliberately tried to shift the debate to the economy. She believes it's strong ground for her. Yet we've seen the Reserve Bank not drop interest rates and two of the major banks increase them anyway, increase mortgage rates, despite the protestations of the Treasurer. Is this more political pain for the government?
No, I don't think so. I think the government's on pretty safe ground when you're talking about the economy. And we need to talk about the economy. You know, it's like Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. We're going into globally. You look at what's happening globally in Europe and across the world. You're seeing all these economic issues and downturns and that. Australia's actually coming through it quite good. Of course it is going to affect us. Of course it's going to have some little hiccups along the way and that. But I think the government's handled it quite well so far.
You're very heavily involved in Indigenous employment and job creation for the Indigenous community. But we've seen, of course, more job losses in manufacturing across the country this week. This also will bite against the government, won't it?
Well, yes, it does have a little bit of a political hiccup, as I said, but it could be worse. There could be a whole lot of other problems that come into it. I think the government's performed in a very difficult climate very well. Everyone can talk about these things, but look, globally, it is a lot of issues that are out there, and I think Australia's performing very well in a very tough time.
Now, what about the leadership speculation? We've seen again this week Kevin Rudd refusing to rule out a leadership challenge. The whole situation festers along. As a former ALP president, does this drive you to despair? Would you like to see this leadership issue brought to a head once and for all?
Look, what's happening is that the Prime Minister is performing very well. In fact, the last 6 months, I reckon she's doing a really good job. She's been very focused.
What's she done well in the last 6 months?
I think look at the way she's presenting herself. Look at the way she's looking at sticking to the economy and getting it back into play. Look at the way she's driving these things ahead. Of course, it doesn't help having these conversations within the media and that about the leadership challenge and so on. But she's doing the right thing. I reckon the polling is a bit of a change. There's a couple of good polls that are coming out now. I think we're a long way from winning an election. You look at the figures there, but I think that we're heading in the right direction.
Do you think that Julia Gillard has been a better Prime Minister than Kevin Rudd?
Oh, that's a good question. Look, Kevin Rudd was a very good Prime Minister when he would come into play. We know what happened leading up to the last election, that there were a number of issues there that come out, climate change issue, for instance, after the Copenhagen debacle, quite frankly, globally, when China and India and the United States refused to sign up to the climate change program. That caused a lot of issues for us. And then you look at the mining tax and so on. I think the Prime Minister has come out, handled those well, got those resolved and getting us to move forward. So one by one she's ticking things off and getting forward. So
do you think Julia Gillard has been a better Prime Minister than Kevin Rudd?
Well, I think we've had very good Prime Ministers within the Labor side of politics.
They've both been great, you reckon?
Yeah.
But isn't this the key question for all Labor supporters and Labor members and all those people you want to vote Labor? Has the shift to Julia Gillard been worthwhile? Has she been a better Prime Minister than Kevin Rudd?
Look, there's no doubt there were problems in the beginning. She's overcome them. She's ticked off the important issues that we had to get through. You look at the carbon tax, you look at the mining tax, we got through those issues. She's dealt with a lot of the economic issues and getting us through a tough time. As I said, the last 6 months she's been very focused, very much on the game, and she's getting a good team working with her.
Well, of course, you don't want to say that she's a better Prime Minister than Kevin Rudd, though. So I won't push her any further on that. It's pretty clear you don't want to say that. Just moving on to those other issues that touch on your work as well. You mentioned the mining tax. Is that a problem for you? You're looking to generate employment and economic opportunities for Indigenous Australians. The mining industry is crucial in that. Is there any risk from the mining tax?
No, I don't think there is. I was just only meeting with the Mineral Council and their people this week. The mining industry is a major player for Indigenous people, and it's been very successful. We're looking at had 5%. A lot of people don't understand that 5% of the mining industry is now Indigenous. It's going up to 9%. In a lot of places, if you go mine by mine, it's 23, 24%. So it's a massive, important employment for us as well as for the wider Australian community. Yes, there are some issues about how we get the two-speed economy to start flowing into the second stage, isn't it? But for us as Indigenous people, it is a major player.
Look, going back a couple of weeks ago, we had that horrible Australia Day protest fiasco down in Canberra. Now, I thought you got into the media quite a bit then, and I thought you were most impressive there, statesman-like even, as an Indigenous leader, saying that Tony Abbott had said nothing wrong, that the protesters had overreacted, and I thought you quite deliberately tried to sort of calm some fairly troubled waters then. Is that the way you saw your role?
Well, I saw that as my role, but also, more importantly, we had to get the message out that this type of behaviour is not acceptable, and also that this is a minority of a minority. It's a very small fringe group of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. I didn't want people to think that these were the spokespeople for Aboriginal people. We saw what happened during the week in Perth. Here we had the real Aboriginal leadership being appointed by the Noongar Nation to negotiate with the Premier over there, Barnett, and yet we had this small fringe group again outside banging in the windows causing problems. They don't represent anything, they weren't elected by anyone, it's just a small fringe group.
Well, just on that, I want to go to Parliament this week, and the opposition tried to bring up the Australia Day riots again, and of course we know that the Prime Minister's office was involved, that a junior staff member has been sacked, but Christopher Pyne in Parliament tried to take this up to the Prime Minister again, saying there must have been more to reveal about what involvement the Prime Minister's office had.
Something very rotten in the Prime Minister's office, and these questions remain unanswered. And while the Prime Minister refuses to answer these questions, a rotten stench lingers over the Prime Minister and her office that saps the very confidence of the Australian people in the office of Prime Minister and those who work for her.
So it's very, very, very robust attack on the Prime Minister there on the Australia Day affair, and of course the Prime Minister responded and tried to draw the debate back to the economy.
Their muckraking and recklessness, their petty politics does them no good. Get involved in the big debate around this nation. Get involved in the debate about jobs, about budget management, about preparing for the future. And if you're not capable of doing that, then just come clean and say to the Australian people, we don't care about these things, because that is what your conduct today is reeking of. You care about your petty politics. The national interest just passes you by.
Well, the issue, of course, then being dragged out by the opposition. And Warren Mundine, I just wonder whether you must have concerns that more than one person in the Prime Minister's office was involved in this. It would seem to me very unusual that a very, very junior media advisor would make the decision that a Prime Minister should not comment on this issue and they should try and get someone else involved on the issue on the day. Are you satisfied with what we've heard from the Prime Minister?
Look, I'm very satisfied about what's happened. I think it's one of these things that, you know, you do have a junior staffer who, quite frankly, went beyond what he should have did. It was dealt with, and it was properly dealt with. I think we need to move on. The Australian public have moved on. We don't want to give oxygen to a small minority group of rabble-rousers and that. I think it was a bit of hyperbole there coming from Christopher Pyne. But then again, that's what oppositions are for. We need to start focusing back on the real issues. The economy is a real issue. Getting jobs is the real issue. Getting us back from being a two-speed economy back to spreading that opportunities and wealth across all industries.
Now, you mentioned protests in Western Australia this week. You're involved in a project that's made the news media again today to develop a new port in the north of Western Australia. Do you expect you're going to get protests against that, both from green groups and maybe from some of the fringe Indigenous groups you talk about?
Look, I have no doubt we'll get protests from the green groups. You've seen what's happening across the Kimberleys with a number of projects that are going on up there. Look, I have no doubt that will happen. But we've got to get back to reality. The reality is the Kimberley's is bigger than Europe. You're talking about one port, you're talking about a wharf, you're talking about these small things. It's like saying, look, a wharf in Italy affects the whole entire European environment. It doesn't. People have got to start focusing on and getting back. The Kimberleys is a great opportunity to develop now. I see the Kimberleys, plus, you look at the Pilbara and towns up and down the coast of Western Australia, being the Townsvilles, the Newcastles, the Cairns, the Wollongongs of the future, which will be great for the development of Australia.
All right, now it's 4 years on Monday since the national apology, which I think was perhaps the greatest achievement of the Rudd-Gillard governments, perhaps from a fairly short list, but I think it stands out as a great national achievement. Are you happy with what's transpired in those 4 years, or do the sorts of protests we're seeing at the moment suggest that we still have a long way to go?
Look, I agree with you, Chris. That was a great achievement, and it was a very unifying achievement. That's the important part. This small group is what I think they've discovered is that the vast majority of Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people, the vast majority of Australians have moved forward. You're seeing that in the corporate world. You're looking at employment programs. Just about every company I go into now has an Indigenous employment program. You look at the funds and the money that's been poured into Aboriginal education. When I was a kid, the idea of going to university, you could count the Aboriginals on one hand. Now there's 15,000, and the rollout's just turning on and on. So we've moved on as a nation, and we're dealing with the real issues in that, and it's really about getting Aboriginal people into the Australian economy, getting into the global economy through things like the mining industry and the energy industry. These are the things that matter.
Well, when it comes to continuing that progress, of course, at the moment we've got this report about the referendum, the proposed referendum on Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. Now, the expert panel has looked at this over a long period of time, a lot of consultation. In my view, a very, very disappointing report, because in my view what they have recommended would never fly, would never get the support of all political parties, would never get passed by the Australian people. So I think that there's a danger here that by their overreach, by trying to put too much into the Constitution, they've set us back some way. Do you think there is any chance that the referendum proposal can get up as proposed by this panel?
Look, the panel's done a great job. Yeah, you've got academics, you've got community leaders, you've got lawyers getting together, and they did a lot of good work in regard to looking at the legality of it, looking at the whole consultation process within the Aboriginal community, the wider Australian community.
But what they've recommended wouldn't get up, would it?
They've produced a good document. This is my view. They've produced a good document. It's now in the hands of the government. The government has to now deal with the reality of the politics of it and bringing all Australians on board, including the opposition. A lot of negotiations, a lot of conversations need to go on now. We're a few years at least away from actually putting up a referendum question. That process will continue, and I'm very confident a very good outcome will happen.
Let me put it to you this way. Would you vote for the changes that have been recommended by this expert panel? Would you support them?
Well, everyone knows my public opinion already. I have some concerns about some of the issues, but that is, my belief is that's not going to be the thing at the end of the day. There's going to be a lot of conversation. We have to bring everyone together. The opposition's expressed doubts about certain things. We've got to bring the opposition with it, because if you know the history of referendums, if you don't have all sides of politics working together, you've got no chance of getting it up. And even with all sides working together, it's still a difficult process.
So you agree it needs to be wound back from what they've recommended to a more minimalist approach, and therefore, but you remain optimistic that if they do that, perhaps a referendum can get up in the next couple of years?
Well, my viewpoint is now for people to sit down and have a relax, digest the document, come up with ideas, have discussions, and then we'll see what happens at the end of the day.
Warren Mundine, it's been great to have you on the program, but before you go, one last question. When are we going to see you in federal parliament?
It's been a common question the last few weeks because of my media appearance. Look, I'm very comfortable at the moment into my bipartisan approach, working with the opposition, working with the government, working with each of the state parliaments around Australia, of getting the economic development we need to happen for Indigenous people.
Sure, but you've stood for the ALP before. Will you do it again? I mean, I think they could do with you in Parliament, is what I'm saying.
Look, I really appreciate that, Chris. I think that, and a lot of people have said that. We'll see what happens in the future. My main concern at the moment is making sure we get through this economic period and get the outcomes that Australians need.
Right, thanks very much for your time, Warren Mundine.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be back after the break with our political panel, where we'll talk about whether or not this was such a good week for Julia Gillard. We'll be joined by Samantha Maiden from Canberra, and in the studio here with me, Cassandra Wilkinson.